Life is all about options, and just like the Cheesecake Factory has a million entrees you can choose from, the Ford Bronco has about a million models you can choose from. But that's a good thing because you can tailor your experience of your lifestyle vehicle to whatever your lifestyle is. So what we're going to be doing today is taking a look at the four-door Bronco and seeing what it has to offer, but more specifically this Everglades model, which is more of a wet climate specific model. And I think as you're going to find out, this is actually a pretty compelling competitor to the Jeeps being offered. We're going to do all of this by taking a look outside. Inside, I'm going to show you some of the features and technology. We're going to try and throw a bike in the back of this thing to see how usable it is as an adventure vehicle. And last but not least, we're going to take it on and off-road to see what it's like to drive. When it comes to lifestyle vehicles, one of the most important things is how it looks. And let's be honest, this Bronco looks pretty badass. Obviously super boxy setup, you get your crazy fender flares, and I don't think anyone's gonna doubt whether or not this is off-road capable just by taking a look at it. The departure angle, the approach angle, the amount of lift and ground clearance on this thing means business. Now with the Everglades model, you can differentiate it visually by taking a look at the sticker here that says Everglades, obviously, Sasquatch here on the side, and then you have a snorkel on the passenger side as well, which is a pretty cool touch. Now this is seen here in azure gray metallic, and oh, by the way, did I mention that you can take the doors and the roof off?
Removing the roof is definitely a two-person job, but you can remove the doors by yourself. It took me less than 10 minutes doing it for the first time and not really knowing what I was doing. All you need is a 13mm socket and or wrench. The doors come out with 2 bolts each, and then you unplug a little harness. Once you get the doors off, it does look really cool, and I really enjoyed driving the Bronco around without the doors.
As we move to the side here and look at these massive tires, we can actually talk more about the different model offerings. Now there are a billion, so we're not going to go in every single one. Go to the configurator if you want that. But the Everglades is largely based on their off-roading model, something similar to their Badlands with their Sasquatch package, which basically means that it has 35-inch tires, it has a lift, it also has front and rear lockers. One thing that's critically missing though is it doesn't have a front disconnecting sway bar, which is something that you do get in the Badlands. It's not even an option on this vehicle. So that's a little bit different. This obviously does come with that snorkel, as we already mentioned. And another thing that it does offer is higher vent tubes for things like your transmission and your diff. That's for if you're going through high levels of water, it won't hopefully take that water into those areas. As we head to the front of the vehicle to talk about engine and transmission, don't think I forgot about this big old worn winch that they have on the front. That's part of the Everglades package, and for $5,000, roughly what the Everglades package cost, not too bad of a value proposition considering that's probably close to a $2,000 winch. Now the engine, 2.3 liter turbocharged 4-cylinder only. You cannot get the 6-cylinder engine in this vehicle, so that's an interesting choice paired with a 10-speed transmission. You can see here the snorkel here on the side that goes to the airbox. Fuel economy is the last thing that we need to talk about. This is really interesting. 18 miles to the gallon city, 17 miles to the gallon highway. So I think it's safe to say that this thing is essentially a sail when you get it up to speed. I've never actually seen a vehicle that was not a hybrid get better fuel economy in the city than the highway. If you know of a vehicle with a 4-cylinder engine that gets worse fuel economy than this, leave a comment below. As we hop in the Bronco, we're met at a bit of a crossroads because some people would get in here and say, wow, this is really cheap feeling. And then some people will get in here and say, wow, this is really rugged feeling. So there is a bit of a crossover point there. And depending on where you fall on that scale is what you're going to think ultimately of this interior. Because ultimately you have a lot of hard, scratchy plastics, which feel a bit cheap, but also once again are easy to clean. And that's kind of the name of the game in this model, specifically because with the Everglades you get these marine grade leather seats that are easy to clean, as are the floors. There's no carpet in here. It is just a hard rubber floor, so you can more or less hose it out. This is meant to be an adventure vehicle. Now, the usability is very positive in here. physical HVAC controls, physical volume knobs, same thing for selecting your track on your infotainment or your music. You know, you don't have to go putzing around with this stuff in terms of when you're off-roading or just driving. You just know where it is and you can set it and forget it. It's good. Same thing with the infotainment. Really easy to get along with. It's just intuitive. The menu structure makes sense. Easy to navigate around. Of course, you have wireless Android Auto and Apple CarPlay, which is mostly what you're going to use anyways. Big old screen too, pretty good resolution and good backup camera. The digital gauge cluster is pretty nice as well because you can customize that. You can go into the off-road modes and see pitch and roll. You can look at your trip and your horrible fuel economy. You can also look at the gauges. And the gauges I really like because you can look at oil temperature, transmission temperature, boost levels. That's pretty cool. Outside of that, the rear seats are really the only other thing to talk about in here. They are pretty good headroom-wise for me at 6'1", but I was surprised that I could barely sit behind myself legroom-wise. Once again, being at 6'1", it's just not a lot of length. Although once those seats go down, you do have a pretty good amount of storage back there. And speaking of storage, let's go and try and throw a bike in the back to see how much room there actually is.
When you buy an adventure vehicle, you expect it to be able to do adventure things, like potentially throw a bike in the back if you want to go mountain biking. And I'm happy to report that you can do that. I have a extra large frame 29er mountain bike that's about as big as mountain bikes get, and it just barely fits. It's really the width in the back that is sort of the limiting factor, but the fact that it fits is really awesome, being that this is a pretty big bike. And as always, if you enjoy the bike test, make sure you're hitting that subscribe button so you don't miss future videos. Before we talk about the Bronco on-road, we really need to talk about it off-road. Let me start by saying I'm a novice to intermediate experienced off-roader, so I haven't done super gnarly trails, but that's a really great test since I was able to do a pretty famous Colorado Front Range trail called Red Cone with complete ease in the Bronco. It has impressive ground clearance stock, and the front and rear lockers make most obstacles really cake. I really only have two complaints about the Bronco when it comes to off-roading. First, I don't like the turbo 4-cylinder for off-road. It's really hard to be precise with the throttle as the power band is pretty rubber bandy. For reference, my personal off-road vehicle for a while was a Land Cruiser with a V8. A V8 allows you to just roll over stuff due to the torque, and it's really easy to modulate over obstacles. The only other complaint I have is most modern off-road vehicles come with front cameras. I'm not sure if that's because the winch on this one or the off-road factory bumper, but this Bronco does not have front cameras. All said and done though, I really enjoyed off-roading this Bronco, and it was a ton of fun.
Time to do some on-road driving in the Bronco Everglades. You have to realize that any lifestyle vehicle or vehicle that's really tailor-made for off-roading is going to be a bit compromised in some ways. It's sort of always this give and take, right? Like when you take away or you add one thing, you kind of take away from somewhere else. That's definitely the case here with the Bronco. Now, what are the compromises? When you create a off-road suspension that's very robust, what is the compromise on road? Well, it's very firmly sprung, and I feel every imperfection in the road. We're on a pretty smooth road, but even when I see these little sort of cracks in the road, I can feel them. When you're on a regular road, just around town, you know, every road these days is all broken up. You feel this very jostly nature of this body-on-frame vehicle. You know, it's not a unibody. It's very much more traditional, obviously more robust, being that it's body-on-frame, but you do feel it. It's not as comfortable to drive around town. Even though you have these massive tires and this like massive travel suspension, it's so firmly sprung that you feel everything. Now, the positive is, even though this is extremely off-road capable, it is unlike Jeeps in the sense that the steering system is different than Jeeps, as is the fact that most of them have a solid axle front end. This does not. This has an independent front suspension. And that is good news for a road like this, where it handles more like a traditional vehicle. It doesn't have a lot of vagueness on center. That's a traditional Jeep quality. Doesn't have death wobble when you put big wheels and tires and the wheel just shakes. If you've never seen that before, just Google a video of death wobble and you will be precisely terrified. But this doesn't have that, so that's good. In that sense, this handles a lot better than most Jeeps that I've driven on road, especially ones that have big tires on them, 35s like this. Now, what is the other main compromise of a lifestyle vehicle that you can take the doors off of, that you can remove the roof from? Well, of course, it's going to be wind noise, right? And road noise for that matter. Anytime you have a roof that is removable, compare that to a roof that is fixed, there's just going to be more wind noise. There's little creases here and there, especially in the highway. You'll hear some whistling, and as much as I try and adjust this roof, it still does it. There's just a lot of wind noise in general from this giant frontal area. A lot of road noise from these massive tires. These are super burly tires, and they just kind of hum, and this is once again not a Bronco problem. This is just a problem to understand if you've never driven or you've never come from a off-road vehicle, and this is like your first dipping your toes into a street vehicle that you can drive off-road. These are compromises. Now, that said, there's some good stuff in here. We already talked about how the front suspension is very good. As much as I didn't like the 4-cylinder off-road because it doesn't have that kind of low-end torque that you want for crawling, for a 4-cylinder and as big as this vehicle is, on road it really moves this thing, and doesn't feel slow really ever. It does take a sec to get it on boil, because it's got a downshift and then it's got to spool up. But man, once you get this thing spooled up, this is a powerful engine. It's actually really impressive. Got a nice growl to it. When it's cold, it sounds like a diesel. I don't know if that's just this engine, because this is a press car and it's probably seen a tough 2,000 miles. But tough to say. Maybe these are just kind of gravelly engines in general. But that goes back, once again, you hear all that stuff and you feel that stuff because there's not a lot of noise reduction in this cabin. It's a very coarse experience. Now, the transmission obviously made it to the engine. It's pretty good, smooth to shift. Having 10 gears is at least nice from fuel economy, although the fuel economy on this thing is heinous because you have massive tires, you have this giant frontal area. I'm averaging 16 miles to the gallon. That's horrible. And how is that possible for a 4-cylinder engine? It's just insane. Not the engine's fault, obviously everything else's fault. But the transmission, my biggest complaint with the transmission, and it's not a massive one, but it is something that I notice here and there. It tends to gear hunt, especially when you're going, up mountains. When you pair a really sort of rubber bandy engine, that is this one, it's a high-strung 4-cylinder with a 10-speed transmission. It's just always kind of like trying to figure out what gear to be in and shifting this way. It's a little bit annoying, and I've always had this problem, frankly, with the Ford 10-speed. Even in the F-150, I feel like it gear hunts more than other 10 speeds that I've driven. But otherwise, the transmission is just fine. Now, how about brakes? Let's test the brakes up here. Another compromise, when you put 35-inch giant wheels and tires and you do not really change the brakes, you have an increased brake distance. This thing does not stop like most regular passenger vehicles. It is compromised in that way. There's a lot of mass behind these wheels and tires, so it's something that you need to be aware of. Oof. And also you got to remember too, these tires are not made for the most on-road grip ever, right? They're made for off-road grip. So you have off-road specific tires, you have more mass, these brakes suffer a little bit. And that's one of the big downsides of doing this, in my opinion, for a daily driver when you put massive wheels and tires. Of course, if you're not getting the super crazy off-road Bronco, this is going to be less of a problem. You get one with more passenger tires, smaller wheels and tires. A lot of these issues will be lesser. Once again, you're still going to have the wind noise, you're still going to have a firm suspension and a lot of kind of NVH in here. But overall, while it seems like I'm probably really down on this vehicle, like I don't like it, or I've talked about mostly compromises, I just want everyone to know, because what's funny is I tend to kind of forgive a lot of this stuff because of the off-roading that I did, the amount of fun I had doing that, and just the fact that this car has so much character. It is so cool to look at. I think the boxiness of it, of course, the fact that you can take the doors and the roof off is super rad. It's just got this like presence about it, and you feel cool driving it. I know that's not an objective thing that you can really measure, but some cars you get in, you feel cool, and some cars you just don't. This just is like a neat thing, and that's a lot about lifestyle vehicles, right? Lifestyle vehicles, the whole premise is that maybe objectively it's not the best vehicle ever, but it's full of character, it's full of whimsy, and even though a lot of this feels, kind of cheap, it's still just like really cool, and it is at least cleanable. We've talked about that. That's the benefit of a cheap plasticky interior, is that it's easily cleanable. Now, the price, 55 grand for this does seem kind of like a lot, but at the same time, if you buy a regular Bronco and then you kind of do all this off-road stuff, it's never going to be as good as this OEM vehicle that's put together for off-road. And I don't know, you probably spend more money doing it. So the question is, how much off-roading are you really going to do? If you're super serious about every weekend going off-roading, sure, like spring for one of these higher end models, because it does feel worth it. It's incredibly capable and super fun. But this one specifically is made for wet weather or wet climates. If you don't live in a swamp, probably forego this one, right? Like there are cheaper models that have just as much off-road goodies for a more traditional sort of off-roading experience. You can get things like the Badlands or the Outer Banks. I believe the Badlands is the one that has all these off-road goodies, but it also has a front disconnecting sway bar, so it's even better off-road. It won't have things like the snorkel or the winch, but it's also $5,000 cheaper. So depending on what your intended purpose is, the nice part is there is a specific model for you. You just have to figure out what that model is. Now, before we end here, I have to give you the snorkel experience. I keep forgetting that the windows are here. So this snorkel is facing right here, and when I open the window, listen to these turbo noises. Hope you guys can hear it. Oh man. Every turbocharged vehicle, I am now convinced, should have a snorkel. It is so cool. It just pipes all the turbo noises directly into your ear. And the nice part is you don't hear it too much when the window's closed, so when you don't want to hear it, you don't really hear it. But when you just crack the window, it just is whistling Dixie. So funny. So that's a great way to end this video, because this car is full of whimsy. Yes, it's super loud on the highway like we have right now, but if you can put up with that and you're willing to go off-roading, not just drive this thing to the mall and back, you will definitely enjoy a Bronco. If you made it this far in the video, thank you very much. Consider hitting that subscribe button, and I'll see you on the next one. Peace.